And in Ontario, most of you will be familiar with what we have in Ontario, which really isn't that far off from where other jurisdictions are. In terms of the environmental site registry, there is a mandatory registration at a change of property use. And Mitch this morning was mentioned sort of asking, well, when do I need to register? There are many people, some of you in this room, who have taken the point of view, I'll always register a record of site condition whether I need to or not, because there are certain benefits to doing that. And I'll touch on those later. But one of the key components of disclosure and of notice is to make use of the record of site condition, even when it's not necessary to do so, because it's one of the few ways you have to communicate down the chain of title to future owners as to what it is that you're leaving behind. There was also some mention this morning about this concept of vertical severance. You know, it's not completely dead yet in the province. There's an issue now. It was a kind of a subtle tweak in terms of the regulation. I'm not going to quote it exactly right, but the idea now is that if you do a record of the basic theory, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is when you're dealing with that problem of the contamination that's deep below the ground, there's nothing stopping you in law generally from simply dividing the property, subdividing it vertically. Just like a condominium is a vertical subdivision above ground, why can't you subdivide below ground? Now, there's nothing in law against doing that. Miners have done it for years, where a mining company will own the subsurface and the farmer above will continue to own the surface. And the law certainly has always allowed that in property law. So why can't that be a solution for a contaminated site? If the contamination is deep below, why not to develop and sell the subsurface and sell the surface and simply hive off the subsurface and put that in separate ownership? Well, there were some concerns about that, and there were some issues with the Planning Act and the ability to do it without even seeking any approval at the end of the day. So it has been tweaked a little bit. It's become a little bit harder to do now because if you're doing a record of site condition, for example, the qualified person now has to say that the land meets and the land below as well, so it has to be a statement made even for the subsurface. But it's still not entirely gone, and there still is some ability to deal with, to use this as a way of dealing with the liability issues. So if you have a completely usable surface that is developable and attractive to a purchaser, but they don't want to pick up the liabilities of the subsurface, this is still a device that, that could work in terms of limiting that liability. So where do we go with this? I'm just going to wrap up with the next couple of slides. What you want is certainty. What all of us want is certainty. Even what the regulators want is certainty. Think about the sources of certainty, and I've listed 5 key sources of how we're going to get certainty. And think about, what do you think, as much as what I think, what do you think are the most likely sources of getting that certainty? Starting at the bottom of that list, and I've listed them very much from top to bottom in terms of what I think is most likely. Starting at the bottom of the list, probably the least likely source of obtaining certainty is going to be from the courts. The case law is specific to its own facts. The courts are dealing with tools that are very difficult and very inadequate to handle liability, environmental liability cases, and there's just simply not enough case law out there to refine the rules for liability. So it's not likely that you're going to see the courts and case law give you much certainty for dealing with brownfields. Well, what about legislation? Well, legislation also has its limits. There's the real political reality that the label polluter pays is very attractive to most taxpayers, and governments perceive more votes there than they do with developers. So even though there are very real problems with that label, refining that from legislation is not something that you can expect to happen with any dramatic change. There'll be some tweaking of the concept. There'll be some refinements. There'll be some ability to maybe make life a little bit easier from legislation, but it's not really realistic to expect much comfort from legislation when it comes to limiting your liability. The good news is that when you look at the first 3, and I'll explain to you why I think they are key in terms of limiting liability, there are actually 3 things that are completely, or a large amount of it, within your own control, as opposed to waiting for government or waiting for the courts to help limit liability. At the root, if you remember back to when I was trying to explain what makes environmental claims so unique and so difficult, At the root of it, somebody called it the fear factor this morning, is the unknown. How much is there? Where is it? What effect is it going to have on me or on other people? Obviously, the key to dealing with that as a concern is to find out as much as you can, and we heard comments about this morning, to learn as much as you can about it, and to disclose. The mantra for this talk is disclose, disclose, disclose when it comes to these properties, because that really is the key. If you're disposing of a property, put as much disclosure as you can, and make it available as widely as possible. You know, if you're worried about, well, is that going to impact on your property value? Well, that's your choice. Decide on that as opposed to just simply living with the liability of not disclosing in the end. In the end, that disclosure is going to be fundamentally key, and it is in the control of the person who is obtaining the information from their consultants. Coupled with the disclosure comes the science. Whether we like it or not, if we work in this field, we need to understand the science. Whether we like it or not, we have to read the technical reports and we have to learn to understand them. It's not just good enough to say to your consultant, well, give me that one-liner that tells me everything is fine. You need to understand so that you can ask the consultant the questions that someone else is going to ask you. And sure, the science is changing. Sure, the science evolves. But a lot of it is really quite well known now. There is enough modeling out there. There is enough understanding of receptors and of pathways and of exposure levels that gives people enough comfort to make decisions today if they take the trouble to understand the underlying science. And this gets us to what is probably going to be the key in terms of what developers are going to be working with in the next few years and what you can do in terms of limiting liability. It's the concept of risk assessment. Again, if you're not familiar, in Ontario there are two ways of achieving a clean site. You can clean up your site by doing what is called a generic cleanup, which means you look up a table and you say, well, what's my use going to be, and then what numbers do I have to achieve for that use. And those numbers are based on certain conservative assumptions that say no matter where in the province your property is, if you're using it for this purpose, then you have to meet these generic numbers and it's going to be a safe use. Now instead of, and it was those numbers that were announced about a year ago that are going to be dramatically changed, and they've sort of gone into limbo at this point because of the outcry that happened as to how those numbers were picked and arrived at. But the alternative way that Ontario says is just as good a way of doing it and just as acceptable to the Ministry of Environment is to conduct a risk assessment. So rather than taking the off-the-table numbers and taking all the conservative assumptions about the use of your property, what you do is you look at those assumptions and say, but do they apply to my site? And as you go through the science and say, well, I'm not going to have this kind of use here, or I'm not going to have this kind of exposure. It's not going to be 24 hours. It's only going to be 8 hours a day. It's not going to be toddlers. It's going to be adults. As you start tweaking those assumptions, the numbers start to change. And the beauty of that is it usually, not always, usually the numbers are in fact easier to meet. But better yet, the numbers are custom made to your site. Sure, it does take time to develop that risk assessment, but now it's no longer based on a regulatory number. It's based on a scientific principle that is tailored to your site. So, for example, even though the new numbers were proposed about a year ago for generic, they really wouldn't have had much impact on anybody doing a risk assessment at the end of the day if that was tailored to their site. So it takes a little bit more upfront money, sometimes a fair amount more to develop a risk assessment, but in the context of disclosure, how much better can you get as a disclosure tool than a document that says here's the science behind why it is that the property is good for its intended use in the end. So risk assessments ultimately have the potential to become a much more powerful limitation on your liability than generic standards ever have. The science is tailored to your site and explicitly stated, and the evidence that's based on risk assessment will answer many potential damages claims. A typical concern I have when people are looking at a risk assessment is, well, but this might result in some restrictions on my use. The risk assessment is going to say, well, I'm going to assume no toddler use. I'm going to assume no daycare. So guess what? Next thing you know, you might see something on title that's saying you're not allowed to have a daycare on the property. Well, my answer to that is, why should that be a concern? if the site under the signs is not appropriate for that kind of use, aren't you better off having something that's actually explicitly, even on title, saying that's not the case? You know, again, developers are used to zoning restrictions all the time. As a liability limiting tool, this is actually a good thing. Because if there is such an exposure, you can say, well, I didn't design my property for that use, and I warned people that it not be used in that way. So in the end, the very restrictions that are there become a form of notice, and ultimately they become a way of limiting your liability. So I've covered a lot of ground at a very high level, but hopefully this gives you a better picture as to how the liability system works in terms of brownfields. And some of the lessons to take out: the limits for contamination are always going to be changing. The numbers will always change. The courts will enforce a properly drafted contract. The actual remediation standards, the scientific numbers, again, if you look at what little case law is out there, you can see that they are becoming increasingly credible and believable as a limit even to liability and negligence. So because the science is becoming more explicitly stated, because it's becoming more widely accepted, those numbers are in turn becoming more widely accepted as a limit to liability. The big question is whether the promise, and I see it as a promise of risk assessments, will be realized or not. Because I think as we see more of them, as people become more familiar with them, as we all do a better job of educating others that a risk assessment is in fact equivalent to a generic and in many ways better, there is a lot of potential promise in risk assessments as a fundamental tool for limiting your liability. And in the end, if you have that disclosure, if you have understanding of what the risk-based values are, you may well have a rational basis to override all the liability concerns of municipalities, of occupiers, of subsequent purchasers, and of neighbors. It's not an easy field. It's certainly one of the not an easy field of law, and it's not an easy field to invest your capital into. And all I can say is that there's no doubt in my mind that if you're a brownfield developer, you're truly one of a unique breed, because you're willing to take on risks that many others aren't. But again, if you do have the understanding of what the reasons are for the policy issues, for the liability, and how to deal with them, it makes it much more manageable to be a member of that unique group. Thank you.